Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gloria, and thanks for those of you who have braved the conditions and the prevailing circumstances to join us in person. And of course, thank you to everybody who's giving up time this evening to join remotely via Zoom. A couple of issues of housekeeping before we begin, and that is last year I had time on my hands, as most of us did, and so I authored a book that looks at how we build a low-carbon, resilient and inclusive world as we go about the process of recovering from COVID. I've brought some books along this evening. They are complimentary, so feel free to take one of the books if you wish, and it will be a resource that hopefully will continue to speak to some of the topics that I present and that we subsequently discuss during the course of this evening. So, make sure I'm doing this properly. Gloria has already been kind enough to give me an intro, so I won't dwell on my biography too much, other than to say that you're all, I'm sure, aware that there is a global climate summit going on in Glasgow, Scotland, as we speak. It featured the great and the good from the public and private sectors during the course of last week. And during the course of this week, the negotiators and civil society participants from around the world are trying to iron out a diplomatic text, a resolution of sorts, that will enable us to build the foundations of a low-carbon, resilient and inclusive society. I'm going to speak to some of that this evening because I have had, for good or ill, the benefit of attending 10 of those climate summits over the course of my career to date. So I'm going to bring to you some perspectives, not just from an outsider looking in, but from someone who has been an insider in that process and, to paraphrase, really knows where all the bodies are buried. Our features this evening, there's going to be three particular areas that we look at. During the course of this year, there has been a flurry of activity, not only political, but also scientific, on the issue of climate change. We had the publication of what's called the 6th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the most definitive, the most comprehensive assessment of what is happening in our climate system, why it is happening, and what the implications are. So we're going to start tonight's conversation by looking at that scientific basis. Then we're going to move on and look at the state of leadership, not only in the public sector with regards to what governments are doing, but also with the private sector, what major multinational corporations are doing and what that means for the real economy more broadly. And then we're going to land that particular conversation by looking at a couple of things closer to home. What is happening in the United States and also what is happening here in Vermont. And in the final part of the presentation, which I hope then is a prelude to our conversation, is going to look at what are the types of things we need to do in order to transition from climate crisis to the opportunities presented by a new climate economy. Feel free at any point during the presentation to ask any questions of clarification that you might have, but also bear in mind that we will have plenty of time at the end of the presentation for a broader discussion. So first, let's get into it with the science. I've strategically placed a number of cartoons in the presentation this evening to try and emphasize a particular aspect that I'm trying to present. And this is a cartoon that came out recently. It was published by colleagues at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Many of you will have been aware, when the science was published in summer of this year, of politicians and corporate leaders describing the IPCC report as, quote, a wake-up call. One person described it as a thundering wake-up call, and many others described it as, quote, code red for humanity. With those sorts of comments, our political leaders, our corporate leaders, were giving us the sense that the information being presented in this 6th assessment report of the IPCC was something quite new, something quite novel, perhaps things we did not already know. And in fact, hearing those sorts of responses to the scientific assessment was extremely frustrating for people like me who've been working on this for a long time, or for people who've been working on it for even longer. Because the truth of the matter is, everything we learned within this scientific assessment that took 7 years to put together, that looked at every peer-reviewed, published scientific article on the state of the climate system, was already known to us. The risks were already known to us, the causes of the climate crisis were already known to us, the solutions were and are already known to us. There were subtleties in the margins of the report that perhaps we weren't aware of. There were pieces of the evidence base that were reinforced, but by and large, what I'm about to present to you in terms of the state of the art for the science has been known to us for decades. The first scientific assessment on climate was presented to President Johnson in 1965. And if you have the time and inclination, there's a wonderful book that's just been published by James Gustav Speth. It's called They Knew, and it actually chronicles what every administration knew about climate change since the Carter administration took office in January of 1977. So everything that I'm about to present to you was known to me when I embarked on my career in 1997. It's not so much we didn't know this. The theme running throughout tonight's lecture is we knew it, we simply didn't act on it. And as we fail to act, as we delay, the steep curve of action gets ever steeper. So let's look at what we do know as a consequence of the science that has accumulated over the course of many decades. The scientific report, when it comes out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, runs typically into thousands of pages. And those thousands of pages are in turn a result of studying hundreds of thousands of pages of published science. But these essentially are the four key concepts that emerge from the science that we must all be aware of. The first is climate crisis is unequivocal. There is no doubt that global mean temperatures are rising. They have risen by over 1 degree Celsius since the dawn of the industrial age. There is no doubt that that rise in global mean temperature is a consequence of the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, but other greenhouse gases as well, including, for example, methane. That is also known to us. It is known to us that the changing chemical composition of the atmosphere and the rise in temperature that happens as a consequence leads to a series of socio-ecological impacts. It leads, for example, to an increase in intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. We've seen that along the Atlantic seaboard in recent years with the increase in intensity and frequency of hurricanes. It leads in an increase in intensity and frequency of, for example, wildfires and heat waves. We've seen that right around the world, notably, of course, in the western United States, with fires raging right across the Emerald Corridor from Washington State and Oregon down into California. It leads to the change in the distribution of water. Places that are susceptible to flooding becoming ever more prone to floods, places that are susceptible to drought becoming ever more dry, and the implications that that has for human systems, notably, of course, food production. So all of this is known to us, and it has not been known to us for a very long time. Second concept, the crisis is urgent. It's not only urgent because with each passing year we pump more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas pollution into the atmosphere. It's urgent because the feedback loops, the way in which the Earth interfaces with the atmosphere, that feedback loop is strengthening all the time. So, for example, as the world warms, the amount of Arctic sea ice dissipates, and ultimately we have patches during the course of the summer where the sea ice is disappearing altogether. That means that more heat and more radiation is trapped underneath the blanket that the atmosphere provides, which intensifies the process of global warming. So the longer we delay, the more pollution goes into the atmosphere, but also we speed up this process of global warming. Third concept is that this is human. The pollution in the atmosphere is not a consequence of planetary activities, tectonic activity, volcanic eruptions, solar flares, proximity to the sun, any of these potential natural variations. It is directly related to human activities, chief amongst those, the way in which we use energy, the way in which we transport people, goods, and services, and the way in which we use land. There's an old adage in climate change that the problem is essentially food, fuel, and footnotes. All of those things combined produce the greenhouse gas pollution. But in addition to that, not only is the problem caused by human activity, but the consequences can either be negated or amplified as a result of human activity. We talk, for example, about climate risk, and climate risk has three components. It has the existence of hazards, for example, hurricanes. It has our exposure to those hazards. If you have a hurricane in the mid-Atlantic, no big deal. But if that hurricane makes landfall in a population center, and if that population center has been poorly designed, then all of a sudden we have a problem on our hands. But there's also a third dimension, vulnerability, the underlying weaknesses in our systems that amplify risk. And those vulnerabilities in human systems are often caused by intersecting inequalities. Political, economic, cultural, social, legal. And because of those vulnerabilities, because of those intersecting inequalities, certain populations suffer from disproportionate risk. For example, women around the world are far more likely to suffer harm from climate change because they are exposed to economic, political, social, cultural, and legal discrimination. Populations of colour, indigenous people, the urban poor, and so on. When these different intersecting inequalities come into play as a result of human choices, risk is amplified. And then the final concept, which is often overlooked, is that all of this is solvable. This is not a crisis that we are doomed to endure for the rest of time. This is something that can be managed in terms of the immediate risk, but it's also something that we can solve, and in its solving, we can actually build a new shared prosperity that we don't currently enjoy. If you look across these different aspects of food, fuel, and footnotes, there are literally hundreds of separate interventions that we can employ today to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also to manage the risk that is currently part of our day-to-day existence. There are things in energy, for example, like changing the energy mix. We can improve energy productivity and efficiency. We can improve energy transmission. We can use far less energy than is currently the case. We can switch from coal to solar or wind or tidal power. Lots of interventions that individually represent relatively modest investments, relatively modest pieces of ambition, but when they're added up cumulatively, they get us from a position of crisis to a position of opportunity. We also know, as a consequence of the science, what the roadmap actually looks like to get us from this moment to a future that is low carbon, resilient, and inclusive. So the first thing we have to do is we have to decarbonize aggressively. What that means is that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions cumulatively as they are currently going into the atmosphere on an annual basis. The goal here is something called net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And what that means is that we must dramatically reduce the amount of greenhouse gas pollution we're putting in the atmosphere, but we must also increase our capacity to absorb the pollution that's going into the atmosphere. For example, through reforestation, through enhancing the capacity of our soils and our oceans to absorb some of that pollution. But in addition to having net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century, we also need to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions during the course of this decade. When I started working on climate change in 1997, we were working on something called the Kyoto Protocol, which many of you will remember. And the Kyoto Protocol target was somewhere in the range of 7 to 9% greenhouse gas emissions reductions over a 15-year period. We did not implement the Kyoto Protocol. We denied and we delayed. And as a consequence, here we are 25 years later, and our target has become 45% emissions reductions over a 9-year period. So because we did not take the opportunity and avail of that particular moment 25 years ago to begin the journey of decarbonisation, the journey has become that much harder. But we must do that to avoid unmanageable climate change. There are certain temperature thresholds beyond which our social and our ecological systems simply cannot adapt, and therefore we must aggressively decarbonise. But the second thing we must do is we must manage unavoidable climate change. There are already impacts that we're experiencing on a daily basis here in Vermont, across the wider United States, and across the wider globe. And we must have the ability to anticipate, where possible avoid, but ultimately to accommodate and recover from those climate impacts that we're already experiencing. And that gets us into the business of first and foremost properly diagnosing climate risk, but then building strategies for resilience. That doesn't only mean building flood defenses. It doesn't only mean putting reinforced concrete into buildings to protect them from hurricanes. It does absolutely mean tackling some of these intersecting inequalities, this structural discrimination that I mentioned earlier. And then third, we have a roadmap that helps us understand the transition that needs to take place to get us from here to there. Because as we go about building a low carbon economy, parts of the high carbon economy will be disrupted. That means farming in Vermont. It means coal across Appalachia. Right across the world, there are coal fields, there are gas fields, there are oil fields, and there's high carbon agriculture and land use. And there are people employed in those sectors. And there are communities who depend on those sectors for their livelihood, for their culture, for their identity. In India alone, there's up to 20 million people who one way or another benefit directly or indirectly from coal. Those people must be invited into a new shared prosperity. But similarly, if you look at a global map for where the 21st century energy system is going to exist, that 21st century energy system is going to be reliant on copper and nickel and graphite and lithium. And those places are not housed, those minerals and metals are not housed in the Middle East or in Appalachia. They're housed in places like Chile or in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they're processed in China, which means the 21st century energy system is going to look very different to the 19th and 20th century energy system. We must make sure, as we're building that new energy system, that it doesn't replicate the extractive and unequal economy that we have built before, but it instead creates a shared prosperity for those countries and those communities. Now, one of the things about the science is that the number 45 keeps popping up again and again and again. And I won't dwell too much on this or waste your time, other than to say that when you hear people talking about net zero by 2050, when President Biden talks about this, when a corporate CEO talks about this, essentially what they're doing is giving you a press release rather than a plan. Because a plan has to be 45% emissions reductions by 2030. If it does not include that target, then basically what people are doing is they're writing checks that someone else will have to cash. They're making promises that someone else will have to deliver on. President Biden probably won't be alive by 2050, let alone in office. And there will be a succession of presidents, Democrat and Republican, in office between here and there. Therefore, the only way to understand a credible plan is to look for this number of 45% of emissions reductions. Currently, all of the pledges that we have internationally only add up to about 7.5% of emissions reductions by 2030. You don't need to be a mathematician to see that that is deeply problematic and incredibly insufficient. What we also need to do, however, is not just focus on 45% carbon dioxide emissions. We have to think about the broader basket of greenhouse gases. Things like, for example, methane that is produced extensively within our fossil fuel industries with fugitive emissions from oil pipelines, from gas flaring, but also within our farming system. Methane emissions coming, for example, from cattle. And we must reduce all of those emissions to net zero by this midpoint in the century, somewhere between 2063 and 2068, 45 years from now. So again, you see the number 45 repeating again and again. If we don't aggressively reduce emissions based on that trajectory, based on that roadmap, we will find that we will breach a very dangerous temperature threshold by mid-century. Already the science is telling us that we need to hold temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But right now we're trending towards over 2.7 degrees Celsius, and we are likely therefore to breach 2.5 degrees Celsius within the next 45 years. Now, to put that number into context, the coral reef systems, upon which 25% of all marine life depend, they bleach at 2 degrees Celsius irreparably. And once we get to 4 degrees Celsius, which we were trending towards before the Paris Agreement, all the basic crops we depend upon for food security, wheat and maize, corn and rice, do not grow in those temperatures. So we're not talking anymore about a scientific problem that will affect people in a distant land in a distant century. We're talking about things that are materializing in the here and now, that are a crisis in the here and now, and will become cataclysmic within the lifetime of our children and grandchildren. One of the things that I have often said is that when I started working on climate change, this did seem like tomorrow's problem. But we now know from the science, and we know from our own observations, that it is today's problem. So if you look at this particular graphic and this particular map, you'll see that the number of natural disasters has increased dramatically between the period of 1980 to 2000 and the 20 years following 2000. And you can see that the principal cause for why natural disasters have increased so substantially is a consequence of climate-related events. And one of the things that has happened is that more than 4 billion people around the world during that period have been affected by climate-related disasters. So these people are not experiencing this from a scientific journal. They're experiencing it in their lived experience on a daily basis, their inability to gather water or food, their inability to have a livelihood, their inability to put food on the table for their children, and provide an income that sustains their family. We also see in the United States that this has real-world financial consequences for all of us, because the number of billion-dollar extreme weather events has increased dramatically, and as a consequence, the amount of funding, the amount of money we have to divert from spending on healthcare or spending on education or spending on infrastructure, and divert that money instead to reconstruction as a consequence of climate-related disasters, has also increased, to the point where congressional appropriations to rebuild from climate-related events reaches approximately $1,000 a year for every American taxpayer. So when people say it's too costly for us to act, the real answer is that it is already costing us as a consequence of inaction. Now, I mentioned that the solutions are already available to us. Just like the problem is not postponed to tomorrow, the action does not need to be postponed until tomorrow either. This particular graphic illustrates a wealth of different interventions that we could take in our individual lives, that our communities could take at a local level, that could be taken nationally and internationally today, that do not require new technologies or new innovations. They can be deployed today. They simply need the political and financial will in order to get these out into the real economy to as many people as possible. Now, I want to move on and talk about the next part of the state of the climate in 2021. We have the scientific basis. We have the foundational knowledge. The question now becomes, do we have the political will, the political leadership to implement what we have learned and to build a new climate economy? Once again, I've deployed a cartoon because the one fundamental truth of this is that we have spent decades talking as an alternative to action. Right now, we have the 26th Conference of the Parties, COP26, happening in Glasgow, Scotland. These have been going on essentially since the early 1990s. And I can essentially write the press release that will be issued at the end of this COP, just like I could write the press release issued at the end of every other COP. That press release usually says something along the lines of, we haven't saved the climate, but we have saved the process. In other words, we haven't agreed to decarbonize, but we have agreed that we will all come back together again this time next year and talk it over a little bit more. That is essentially the press release in one form or another that's introduced at the end of COP every year. So let's go through some of the dynamics and let's talk about what leadership actually looks like. So the first thing I would say is that as someone who's trained to be a consultant, it's my job in the very first conversation to sit down with someone and ask them, what is your vision of success? So my first question when sitting with political leaders is, what do we want the world to look like in 2030 as a consequence of our gathering, as a consequence of our talking, and hopefully as a consequence of our action? And what I would say is that one of the traps we have fallen into in our leadership model is that we're always chasing yesterday's success. We're always trying to scale up a model of success that's happened some years past. And what we're currently trying to do in climate world is we're trying to scale up 2015. In 2015, we agreed to the Paris Agreement. And that Paris Agreement was mostly, not exclusively, but mostly about the reduction of greenhouse gases consistent with 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it was about decarbonization. It has failed to implement the promise of decarbonization, which is its first problem. But its second problem is that the world has moved on since 2015, and the world as it will be in 2030 looks very, very different. And that means that our political leaders must have a new vision and not just simply chase the 2015 vision. And what I've done here is I've tried to outline what that vision looks like. So first of all, it does look like 45% emissions reductions by 2030. That is a very different energy, food, and transport system to the one we have in the United States today. But it has to be more than that. Because we experience climate change on a daily basis, our 2030 vision also has to include resilience. And that in turn means we have to now tackle the structural discriminations that amplify risk. But it equally means that we must build a society that is inclusive. One of the things that's bothered me, and one of the things I address in the book, is that when COVID occurred, we would hear words like restore, return. In other words, we need to get back to the economy as it was in December of 2019. But the reality is that the economy of December 2019 was a failing economy. It was failing because it was high carbon. It was failing because it was extractive. It was failing because it was unequal. It was failing because most middle-class Americans could not have access to healthcare or education at an affordable price. It was failing because too much wealth was concentrated into too few hands. It was failing because it was an extractive economy that took things from people and planet as opposed to a regenerative economy that gave things back to people and planet. And the way in which we get around that dilemma, the way in which we truly build back better, is not simply by pumping money back into fossil fuels, not simply pumping money back into pharmaceuticals companies, but by actually thinking about what does 21st century infrastructure actually look like? How do we use this moment to strengthen civil and political, economic and social rights? How do we build a shared prosperity as we go about the process of decarbonization? We're going to spend trillions of dollars over this decade on our energy system. And if at the end of that expenditure, 22,000 children continue to die every day from hunger, 800 million people around the world continue to suffer from chronic food insecurity, 60 to 100 million women are disappeared because of inequalities in different societies around the globe, what will all of this have been for? So our vision cannot just be a vision for what the atmosphere looks like. Our vision has to be one of what our societies more broadly look like. So what's going on in Scotland at the moment? Well, you have about 20,000 people who have convened either in person or remotely. And one of the things they've been doing is updating national commitments from 190 plus countries from around the world. So the US government shows up and says, this is our commitment on behalf of the American people for the coming decades. And the Chinese and the Indians and everyone does the same, right down to the smallest nation on earth. So national commitments have been updated. Second thing is that corporations have been showing up and doing exactly the same thing. It is pretty much impossible now to be a successful company, either in terms of reputation, or in terms of sales, or in terms of your ability to bring in investments on capital markets and from institutional investors, unless you're making climate commitments. It has become one of the costs of doing business. And as a consequence, companies from across the world, representing trillions of dollars, have been showing up in Glasgow and committing to net zero greenhouse gas emissions and setting up various types of collaborative initiatives that lead us towards decarbonisation. Initiatives around renewable energy, initiatives around electric vehicles, initiatives around deforestation. So companies are showing up en masse. One of the commitments that have been made are commitments around forests. So for example, more than 100 countries around the world have now committed that they will reverse deforestation by 2030. And one of the major announcements that was made last week concerns methane. More than 90 countries have agreed that they are going to drastically reduce methane by up to 30% by the end of this decade. So if you're reading the news on a daily basis, the impression you're getting is that the leaders from the public and private sector are showing up and they are tackling or maybe even solving this particular problem. But there's a couple of things to bear in mind. The first is where we are now heading as a consequence of promises, not necessarily the delivery of those promises, just those promises, is still a problematic trajectory. So before the Paris Agreement happened, we were heading towards a world trending towards the top of that particular curve. Now, as a consequence of the Paris Agreement, of the pledges that have been made since, and of the pledges that have been made in Glasgow, some people reckon that we're now on a course for about 1.9 degrees Celsius. But most people understand that we're actually on course for 2.7 degrees Celsius. And the reason for that is because most of the promises made in Glasgow are promises out to 2050. They're not promises out to 2030. In fact, what's happening out to 2030 is that we're expanding coal production and we're spending more money on high carbon activities rather than less. So there is a discrepancy between the promises that are being made for the long term and the actions that are being delivered in the short term. Now, this is materialized, in fact, when you look at the individual commitments that have been made by countries. There's a wonderful resource called Carbon Tracker, which brings together some of the best institutions on climate change in the world. And they've done an analysis of the different countries and the promises that those different countries are making. And all you need to do, as a takeaway from this particular slide, is to see that the only country in the world that is considered to be doing this properly in a manner that is robust, in a manner that is accountable and truly ambitious, is the country on the far right-hand side of this graphic. All of the major countries of the world, where the bulk of production of greenhouse gas emissions rest, and crucially, where the majority of consumption of greenhouse gas emissions occur, those countries are falling behind and failing. That is the Gambia. And I don't think you need to be a climate expert to realize that the Gambia is not the cause of this problem. The cause of this problem is, of course, places like the United States and China and India, the European Union, predominantly industrialized countries and more recently emerging economies. So even, for example, if you wanted to point a finger and blame Saudi Arabia and say the climate crisis is caused by Saudi oil, even that would actually be misleading, because the truth of the matter is that over 80% of all Saudi oil goes to 5 economies. It goes to Europe, it goes to the United States, it goes to India, China, and Japan. So even though the Saudis are producing, we're the ones consuming. The American population is about 4% of the global population, but about 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And even 23% of all goods and services made in China are embedded with greenhouse gas emissions that are consumed in Europe and North America. So ultimately, thank you to the Gambia for having the ambition and the accountability to lead on this issue. But the real problem is that all of these other countries on the left-hand side of the slide are not acting with sufficient ambition. Now, I talked about the problem with consumption. And the problem of consumption is really an accountability problem. And it's best identified and illustrated by the host nation itself. The United Kingdom is hosting COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. And if you look at the United Kingdom, they have done a great job on paper of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions over the course of the last number of decades. But when you look and read between the lines, what they've actually done is they've offshored their greenhouse gas emissions the same way industrialized countries have offshored their employment and their manufacturing to countries in the global south. Because the reality now is that 46% of their emissions are as a consequence of imports. So their consumption has not declined. Their production emissions have really declined, but their consumption emissions have not. And that is because they have not fundamentally changed their lifestyle. They continue, unfortunately, to have a high carbon consumption pattern. And that is something that you see in other industrialized countries around the world, and something that is neglected, unfortunately, in the negotiations in Glasgow. We recently heard, for example, Secretary Kerry, who's the President's chief foreign advisor on climate change, echoing something that was originally said by George H.W. Bush in the 1990s, which is essentially the American lifestyle is not up for negotiation. Unless we are willing to negotiate our lifestyle, unless we're willing to think about our food and our energy and our mobility, then we're not going to solve this problem with a quick technological fix. So there's an ambition gap in Glasgow because countries are not coming with strong enough pledges, but there's also an accountability gap in Glasgow, meaning that even when they do come with promises, those promises fall apart very quickly under scrutiny. And I want to give you an illustration, one illustration only, of what that looks like. And the illustration is through the lens of money. So in climate world, we often talk about the figure of $100 billion per year. And the reason we talk about that is because famously Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, went to the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009. And on the back of an envelope, she wrote $100 billion per year. And we talk about that as the price of decarbonization, but in reality, it was the cost of the deal. Let's put $100 billion per year on the table, and we'll get 196 countries to sign up to decarbonization. So in 2009, the rich countries of the world promised $100 billion per year. They've never delivered on that promise. They have fallen well short. Even as recently as 2019, the figure being mobilized was close to $80 billion. And again, when you read between the lines, it wasn't really $80 billion because it wasn't grants to emerging economies and developing countries. It was concessional loans, and it was often concessional loans tied with conditionality. So for example, the Japanese would promise a developing country, you can have some of our money, but you must use that money to buy some of our goods and services. So they never reached that amount of money. But the bigger problem is they've been focused on the wrong money because we live in a $90 trillion global economy. And even if you were to mobilize $100 billion per year, that will never beat $90 trillion going in the wrong direction. And the fact of the matter is, as President Biden stands up in Glasgow and promises that the United States will finally capitalize the Green Climate Fund and will finally, after all these years, pay the US contribution to that $100 billion, at the same time, he and other global leaders are sending money, more money, in the opposite direction. So $100 billion per year is going on decarbonization, but more than $3.3 trillion in one form or another is going to subsidize fossil fuels. And that's not just money going into the pockets of fossil fuel companies. That is greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution that is responsible for 9 million premature deaths annually. So if you look at fossil fuels, we have huge amounts of money going in the wrong direction. And if you look at land use, we have huge amounts of money going in the wrong direction. $540 billion per year going on global farm subsidies. Much of that money keeping markets restricted from access to farmers in developing countries. Much of that money going to a very small clique of very, very large companies. Most of the money, in fact, goes to about 20 companies. To put that number into perspective, about $14 trillion was spent in Afghanistan during the course of the 20-year war there. And in 2020 alone, Lockheed Martin, one company, received $75 billion from the Pentagon. So we cannot mobilize $100 billion per year in climate finance for 196 countries, but we can mobilize $75 billion for Lockheed Martin from the Pentagon budget. When leaders show up for these sorts of summits, what they're offering us is a performance. They're not really offering us decarbonization. They're really not offering us resilience, and they're not putting a down payment on a new economy. And they're doing that because we do not hold them accountable. Now, bringing this all close to home, looking at the United States and Vermont, and maybe this is something that we will have a conversation about in a little while. We, of course, have a tendency to compare things in relative terms. So many people will, of course, justifiably compare President Biden's climate agenda with the climate agenda of his predecessor, which was a non-existent climate agenda. But we've reached the point where we actually have to look at these plans in absolute terms. And if you look, for example, at the Build Back Better plan that started out as a $3.5 trillion plan, but is now being whittled down to about 1.7. It's not only about the amount of money, it's about looking at what that money is being spent on. That money is completely gutted of expenditure on decarbonization relative to where it started. And it's no coincidence that the money has been gutted as a consequence of an intervention from the senator from West Virginia. The reason for that is because the senator from West Virginia is dependent on coal money and coal votes to get re-elected to the Senate. The senator from West Virginia is himself the benefactor of a coal brokerage firm. That's where he made his own personal fortune. And there's a nice symmetry to all of this because I mentioned earlier that my career began with the Kyoto Protocol approximately 25 years ago. That very same Kyoto Protocol, which was essentially killed by the United States and was essentially killed by the then senator from West Virginia, a man called Robert Byrd, who was instrumental in passing the votes for something called the Byrd-Hagel Resolution, which said that the United States would not sign up to any international agreement on climate change if it was forced to take emissions reductions pledges that other countries, particularly China, were not equally party to. So what we have in the United States is, again, promises being made, those promises not being implemented, those promises not being implemented for the very same reasons that they have not been implemented in the past. It's as if we're incapable of learning from previous experience and that we repeat this same pattern again and again and again. We will not solve this problem until we solve the issue of a societal consensus in the United States. We will not solve this problem until we learn to bring coal communities and other high carbon communities along with us in this transition to a new economy. And so far that is not happening. Then in the case of Vermont, years ago when I first came to Vermont, I was a technical advisor to the Vermont Climate Commission. 5 years later, we don't have a Vermont Climate Commission, we have a Vermont Climate Council. The name has changed, But likely they are going to produce the same sorts of recommendations as the Commission produced, about 54, I think it was, recommendations 5 years ago that went to the governor, that went to the governor's agencies, and none of which were implemented, none of which were funded. So now we have a Vermont Climate Council. I understand that the report and the recommendations are going to come out during the course of December. I have not read the report because I have not seen the draft. But what I can tell you is I'm already fearful that they will miss the mark because they will focus on the wrong things. They will again make promises that are not implemented. They will again talk in the language of climate crisis, but they will not talk in the language of opportunity. One of the things I found, going around not just Vermont, but also around the broader region over the course of the last number of years, is that there are communities in this region that have suffered from deindustrialization, from globalization, from underemployment, from unemployment, from opioid addiction, and from all manner of other social and economic ills. The last thing those communities need is another crisis. And they don't have to have another crisis, because if we were creative, if we were smart about this issue, we would come to them and we would say, a new climate economy is a boon for this state. It is a job creation strategy. It is an economic development strategy. We will bring inward investment from outside this state into this state because of all of these countries, because of all of these companies making climate commitments, because they need what we have to offer. But I don't think the Vermont Climate Council is going to make that argument. Which gets us to the final part of the presentation, how we land all of this. The first way we land all of this is I have always thought that there is a framework for how we go about being leaders on climate. And that framework is something I've always called act, enable, and influence. And what act means is what can we do within our own lives to contribute to this journey towards a low carbon, resilient, and inclusive economy. And there are things that we can do. We can address our diet, for example. We can minimize food waste. We can minimize our use of and consumption of red meat, particularly beef. We can change our energy use, be more energy efficient, and switch, where possible, from fossil fuel use, like propane in our homes, to cold climate heat pumps. We can think about solarization in our homes. We can change our transportation modalities. We can switch to electric vehicles where possible. Even better, we can use vehicles less, or we can share vehicles more. So there are lots of things that we can do in order to contribute to solving this problem. But the truth of the matter is, your individual action counts for very little, because ultimately we've reached the point where we have to change systems. Your individual action will be something that allows you to live with a clear conscience. Hopefully it will be something that you can model for your neighbor. But we're going towards a global population of 10 billion by the middle of this century. And that global population, for the most part, lives within political and economic systems and energy systems and food systems and transport systems that have been created over a long period of time. And those systems must be changed, which gets us to enable and influence. Enable means learn about this issue and try to change other people's hearts and minds. Unless, for example, we change this new dynamic in the United States, where we advance on climate change under a Democrat president and regress under a Republican president. Unless we build a societal consensus in this country that mirrors the societal consensus that exists elsewhere, we're not going to be able to change those systems. So what we need right now is not another Democrat championing this issue. We need conservatives and evangelicals championing this issue. Can you find those people? Can you influence those people? Can you equip those people with the right arguments so that they will become champions within their communities? We have an opportunity here this evening to speak to the next generation. And yet there are no students from Long Trail School in this auditorium or watching on Zoom. It's very rare that you will find students from Burton Academy attending talks on climate change when these talks are hosted over there. What can we do to make sure that the climate challenge is picked up by that generation and that they're leading this, not just through their activism, but also through whichever employment they happen to find themselves in going forward? But the key issue, the issue is really influence. How do we influence changes in the real economy? How do we influence change in our politics? It is striking to me that 90% incumbency rate in the United States Congress. It is striking to me that the average age of the US Senator is 64 years old. It is striking to me that Patrick Leahy has been a United States Senator since before I was born, and I'm 46 years old. We need a fundamental change of leadership in our economy and in our politics, or we are going to repeat the same pattern of promises that are not implemented, the same pattern of failure. And in order to do that, there's a couple of things we need to have. The first is creativity. I do not doubt the intent, the good intent, of the report that will come out of the Vermont Climate Council, but I do doubt that it will have any creativity whatsoever. I do believe it will lack imagination. And so similarly, when we had last year trillions of dollars being spent on COVID recovery, most of my peers in the climate community were not focused on how those trillions of dollars would be spent. They were instead looking towards Glasgow. They were not thinking about the fact, for example, that billions of dollars are shielded in tax havens, that billions of dollars are passed down from one generation to the next through inheritance without ever being taxed. And as a consequence, we are not mobilizing the types of financial resources that we could to fuel the transition to a different economy. They were not looking at economics, they were thinking about announcements. They were not thinking about how, for example, gender empowerment, gender sensitivity, gender transformation is the key building block to climate resilience. They were not thinking about the fact, for example, that as President Trump was withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, he was doing far more damage by packing the federal judiciary with justices who are opposed to climate leadership. And right now, they're not thinking about the fact that possibly the single most important climate initiative in the entire United States is not an energy policy, it's a Voting Rights Act. Because if you do not have a political system that is elastic and responsive to the fact that people genuinely are demanding a different type of economy, then you will not build that new economy. So climate activism doesn't mean energy policy, it now means expanding the Voting Rights Act, the franchise, changing the fact that, for example, we have 15 million senators in the United States, 15 million voters who have voted for 50 Democrats in the United States Senate, more than we have for the Republican Party, and yet it's tied at 50-50. We also need to have courage to push for transformation. Too much of what we do is incremental progress. President Obama, for example, has been in Glasgow this particular week, telling young people around the world that they must continue to be angry and pushing for transformation. And yet, 8 years in office, he waited until his final year to take this agenda seriously. And if anything, he was the embodiment of incrementalism. We've now run out of time for incrementalism, which means we have to be more courageous at holding people accountable than we have been previously. And in professions like the one I hold, we have to be far more forceful in giving harsh truths to the people we work with. Many of the people in my community, for example, continue to fixate on payroll. If I upset this particular client, they won't come back and work with me again. Therefore, I will tell them what pleases them, as opposed to telling them what they need to hear in order to lead transformation. We cannot support the Biden agenda on climate change with closed eyes and closed ears just because we're part of the same tribe. We have to demand more ambition, and that requires courage. That was my last word before we have a conversation. I mentioned that there's a book, feel free to take it. There's also a new book coming out which looks at climate leadership within the private sector. That I do not have to give for free. That is something you'd have to buy, but it is available. And again, thank you so much for joining via Zoom and also in the audience. Very happy to take any comments or questions you might have.
It seems to me, from what you said, the two ways to really attack the problem: education, people have to be aware of the dangers, but technology, new innovation, seems to be more important than summits and meetings and reports that come out. That the new innovation can give us the technology that can reduce these greenhouse gases. I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Thank you for the question. So let's start with education. I would like to discuss education not in terms of the confines of a school or a college. I would like to talk about education in terms of how we each increase our collective understanding of this issue and our ability to respond. So for example, I often talk about 4 segments. There's a segment of our society that is uninformed about this issue. They simply don't know the climate crisis is happening. They simply don't know that we can transition to a better economy as we go about solving the problem. They're not tuned into this issue, nor necessarily should we expect them to be. Those people who are uninformed need to be reached. We need to engage them and we need to equip them. Then there are people who are misinformed, and I would argue possibly even misled. They are tuning into certain media outlets, they're following certain people of authority, and they're being sold a lie. They're being sold multiple lies. They're being told that climate change isn't happening. When that lie breaks down, they're being told it is happening, but we're not causing it. When that lie breaks down, they're being told it is happening, we are causing it, but it's too costly to do anything about it. And when that lie breaks down, the conversation is switched to something else. So those people are being misled, and we've got to try and find a way of bringing those people back into the fold. And I think the way you do it is you identify what I call the right influence champions. So for example, somebody like Barack Obama or Al Gore or Hillary Clinton is not going to reach those people. You need a different spokesperson. And we have done a very, very bad job at cultivating and giving space to those different types of spokespeople. There's then a third category of people who are the ones doing the misleading. And they're people who are heavily invested in a high carbon economy. They're people who are either in the real economy, people, for example, who are running coal companies, or people who are running institutions, think tanks in Washington, D.C., like the Heritage Foundation or the American Enterprise Institute, that are funded, the Cato Institute, the Koch brothers funding these sorts of bodies. They're deliberately trying to mislead people because their profits come from pollution. And for those people, we have to go after them aggressively. We have to go after them aggressively in terms of finance, but we also have to go after them aggressively in terms of cutting down their opportunities to mislead people. And then there's a fourth category of people, and they're the people who are miscommunicating. And people like me fall into that category. We've spent far too long talking about climate change as an environmental problem that affects glaciers and ice caps and polar bears. We did a very poor job at making people understand it's about your health, it's about your job, it's about your livelihood, it's about your human rights. But we've also spent far too much time talking about climate change as crisis and not nearly enough time talking about the new climate economy as one of opportunity. For example, we can create millions of new jobs over the next decade in decarbonization of energy and decarbonization of land use. And the reason for that is because renewable energy, for example, creates 12 times as many jobs as fossil fuel energy. Fossil fuel energy, a lot of the money you spend goes on resource, land rights. Renewable energy, a lot of the money goes on salaries for people actually installing stuff and building stuff. Climate-proofing infrastructure, we can create lots of jobs through that. So there's an economic opportunity here. In Vermont, for example, Vermont is a state that could easily be attracting companies into this state who are desperate to get their hands on renewable energy in order to fuel their activities. But I don't see anybody from Vermont going around the country and attracting those businesses with the story that we have to sell. What I see instead are political leaders in Vermont going into communities who have many crises already and giving them an extra crisis to deal with. So I think education is absolutely important, but it's not just about what we put on a curriculum in a university or in a school, as important as all that is. It's about how we talk about this issue, how we segment the society, and how we try to reach people. And then your second question on the question of technology. I do think technology is really, really important, but I think technology doesn't emerge, it doesn't get scaled, and it doesn't get deployed within a vacuum. It happens as a consequence of an enabling environment. And that enabling environment is political and financial. So we are seeing right around the world a movement away from coal. It's not nearly as fast as it ought to be, and in some particular geographies, it's actually increasing in production. But more broadly, we're seeing a dramatic movement away from coal towards renewable energy sources. And the reason for that is because less people want to buy coal, because there are fewer incentives to produce coal, and because the enabling environment to fund and build alternatives to coal is getting better with time. It's not getting better nearly as quick as it ought to, but it is getting better. So the policies we put in place, the places and the ways in which we direct our money, they're all crucial because we cannot get to technology without all of that. And then the last thing I would say is, we cannot simply depend on technology without being willing to change our own human behavior. So for example, an electric vehicle is a very, very good thing. It's far better than a hybrid, which is far better than an internal combustion engine Subaru like the one I drive, which is far better than a gas guzzling SUV. But an electric vehicle is not actually the solution. The solution is using less transport of that nature, using more public transportation, building walkable communities, building bikeable communities. We're sort of, I think, fixated on the fact that technology is going to be the solution that means we don't have to change anything about the way we consume. And ultimately, I think we're going now, because of delay and denial, we're going to have to do both. We're going to have the innovations, the low carbon technologies, but we are going to have to grapple with the fact that our lifestyle is not sustainable. And it's certainly not sustainable when you pass it on to billions of people around the world who aspire to the same lifestyle that we have.
Okay, we have a question from our Zoom audience. Why did the Chinese and Russian leaders not show up in Glasgow? What does that mean in terms of international cooperation on climate change?
I personally wouldn't read too much into that. I don't obviously have President Putin on speed dial, so I haven't asked him why he didn't show up. I would say that you need to draw a distinction between Russia and China. They're not the same beasts, if I can put it that way, when it comes to climate change. Russia is very much a laggard on this issue and has been for a very long time because of its dependence and Putin's own personal dependence on the fossil fuel industry. I think China is very different. China has really quite an ambitious climate plan for a country at its stage of development. It has committed to, for example, renewable energy at the scale of replicating the entire electricity generation of the United States within the course of this one decade, which is an absolutely phenomenal commitment to make. It has promised to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by sometime around mid-century. I think the target that they've set is 2060, which in terms of their historic development trajectory is really bending the curve very, very early compared to what industrialized countries will have done. It's also very important to bear in mind that a lot of China's emissions, I mentioned 23% earlier of Chinese emissions are embedded in goods and services for export, so that continues to be linked to our own consumption. So first and foremost, I wouldn't equate Russia and China. I don't think they're the same. I wouldn't read too much into the fact that the two leaders did not show up in Glasgow. What I'd be more inclined to do is really look into the details of what both are committing to and seeing whether or not those commitments are implemented over time. I have much more confidence that China will implement their commitments than, for example, I would have in Russia. I may even have more confidence in China's ability to implement their commitments than I have faith in, for example, the US's ability to implement its commitments.
You mentioned the Vermont story a couple of times. Could you elaborate a little more on that and what you think Vermont has to offer in this whole scenario?
Yeah, so let me give you a very tangible example. I said that there are companies who are making commitments to decarbonize, and it's a phenomenal number. It's 6,000 companies around the world who are collectively worth $36 trillion. And they've made a variety of different commitments. Their commitments on renewable energy, on deforestation in their supply chain, on electric vehicles, all sorts of different types of commitments. Because those commitments are made to their shareholders, publicly disclosed, they are forced, in a sense, to move towards honoring those commitments. And they are making changes in their business models and their practices to accommodate those targets. So if you look, for example, at technology companies, a lot of their emissions come from data centers. And if they're housing their data centers in a state that only provides them with fossil fuels as an energy source, then they're deciding to relocate their data centers. Now, where are those data centers going? Well, the province of Quebec to our north have made a very good choice. They've decided that they're going to have climate ambassadors, and they're going to go out to all of these different companies, and they're going to say to them, if you want renewable energy, in order to meet your commitment to your shareholders, we can provide you with all the renewable energy you need. Bring your investment, bring your jobs to Quebec. And that's what they're doing. Similar things are happening in Europe, where some of the companies, Apple, for example, made a decision to relocate one of its hubs from the west of Ireland to Denmark because of permitting issues around on-site renewable energy generation. So in Vermont, we have a huge reservoir of renewable energy, but we also have enormous carbon sinks through our forests. And if we were smart in Vermont, we would be using both of those resources to go out and direct inward investment into our state. So again, it's a perspective change. Instead of saying there is a crisis, Vermont needs to respond to that crisis, the mentality is there is an opportunity. There is a new economy being created. Are we going to seize the opportunities of that new economy? I think Vermont is well positioned to do that, but I don't see the creativity that leads people to make those sorts of judgments. And I can give you a very practical example of how I've seen that in operation. I can recall going to Montpelier and giving a presentation to members of the House and the Senate. And at the very beginning of the presentation, I asked them 3 things. Are you looking to reduce greenhouse gases in Vermont? 2, are you looking to contribute to global decarbonization? Or 3, are you looking to build a low carbon, resilient and inclusive economy? And most people in the room thought that they were 3 versions of the same question. They're not. They're very different questions. Vermont is responsible for 0.1% of 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if Vermont decarbonizes entirely tomorrow, it doesn't solve the problem. And yet most of what comes out of the Vermont Climate Commission, most of what comes out of the Vermont Climate Council, I suspect, will be about directing money towards that, as opposed to thinking about all of these countries are making commitments, all of these companies are making commitments. The economy of 2050 is not going to be the economy of 2015. What are we going to do to set up Vermont to succeed in that new economy? What are our investments in vocational training? Are we preparing the next generation to be engaged in wind and solar power? Are we training the next generation to be involved in regenerative agriculture? Are we training them to be involved in different forms of weatherization programs? Or are we still paying them to go to a liberal arts school to learn field journaling? So I just don't see a lot of imagination. I see good intent, but I don't see a lot of imagination, and I see too much focus on crisis and not enough focus on opportunity.
We have a question here again from the Zoom audience. How do you overcome NIMBYism in the permitting process in Vermont for renewable projects?
The short answer is I don't know. I don't have a silver bullet answer for how you overcome NIMBYism. What I suspect we need to do, again, is we need to focus on the right priorities, and we need to focus on dialogue. And we need to make sure that we are sharing opportunity broadly. So let me focus on a couple of those things. Most of Vermont's electricity already comes from what I would call renewable sources. Now, there's some other people in this community, for example, who would disagree with that characterization because they would say, well, hydropower still involves various types of social impacts, notably on indigenous populations, and it also involves a certain amount of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions in its supply chain. Absolutely. But the reality is, we're not in the same situation with our electricity generation in Vermont that other states would be in, who are heavily dependent either on natural gas or on coal. So I think one of the things we have to do is to pick which battles to fight. And I don't necessarily think that the best battles to fight in Vermont right now are battles around the placement of windmills. I think there are other more important battles that we should fight in Vermont, such as, for example, talking about opportunity, such as, for example, building resilience into the Vermont economy and society to account for the climate impacts that we're already experiencing here, such as thinking about transportation issues in Vermont, which is a major source of our greenhouse gas emissions, and most importantly, thinking about agriculture in Vermont. So I actually think, and again, this is a controversial viewpoint, I'm sure I'll be criticized for it, the Vermont Climate Council very early on became essentially a Vermont Energy Council, because too many of the people who are placed on that council are people who are either working with or for parts of our electricity system. And as a consequence, I think their final work is going to be skewed towards that particular sector and that particular issue, as opposed to looking more broadly at other issues. So I think we're fighting the wrong battles, is part of the problem. The second part of the problem is, and this is not restricted to Vermont, it happens right around the world, too often certain individuals bear the cost of localizing something on their land, whether it's a windmill or a solar farm, without necessarily generating rewards or benefits from that service. So I think one of the things we could do to counter NIMBYism is making sure that much more of the reward is shared amongst those people who are currently bearing the cost, and that just simply isn't the case. The final thing I would say maybe about Vermont and again, this relates to the issue of creativity, is that if you think of how Vermont has been able to punch above its weight or its size, then you think of somebody like Bernie Sanders, who was able to put different issues on the national and even international agenda that weren't previously there. But if you think of Vermont's most important contribution on climate change, it was probably the Attorney General of the state of Vermont deciding in 2007 to join a landmark court case called Massachusetts versus EPA. And that was a case led by the state of Massachusetts, brought against the federal government, that asked for greenhouse gases to be regulated under the Clean Air Act like any other pollutant. And the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in favour of Massachusetts, which gave the President authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, to put in place, for example, the Clean Power Plan. Now that case could easily be overturned by this current court. I doubt very much that the court with its current composition would vote in the same way, which means that yes, the State House in Montpelier is important, but not nearly as important perhaps as the Attorney General. Not nearly as important, for example, as the person within the government of Vermont that controls public procurement. So again, it's not just about what laws we put in place. It's not just about one or two individuals within the State House. It's about thinking through more holistically, what can this state do? What can people in positions of authority actually do? Are they mandated to do this type of work or not? Are they focused on this type of work or not? I think states and provinces where this is successful are states and provinces that have more imagination and more creativity.
I want to start off by making a comment. I feel that the young people of the year 2100 will probably be saying, what were they thinking in 2021 and 2030 and 2040? What were they thinking? But the problem is, it seems to me, is that you're asking, in a democratic society, you're asking people to make a huge lift. And one of the problems with democracy, particularly here in the United States, but also in Europe as well, is that it's not an us society, it's a me society. What's in it for me? And when you have a democratic system which has elections every 2 years, there is very little that can actually be ever achieved in 2 years. It is, as you say, it's going to be achieved in decades. And people who live in a me society don't think in terms of decades. They say, what is in it for me now? Now, to be specific, and I want to talk about heat pumps, there has been a suggestion and a proposal that by the year 2035 or something, all boilers, all systems should be replaced by heat pumps. But for people who are on $25,000 a year or $30,000 a year, a man, his wife, and 2 children, there's no way that they can afford that kind of expenditure. Going into electric cars and going into various other things. So it seems to me that one of the uphill struggles you have and people like you have is how do you say, how do you prepare, how do you persuade a me society that thinks in short term to think in the long term? And finally, of course, we all know that the politicians never think long term because they're in the House of Representatives elected every 2 years, and therefore they never will. They will constantly kick the can down the road. And so in the end, you finish up with a situation where the crisis has got to get worse before it gets better. That's the only way that human beings tend to react. And I applaud your call for seeing this as an opportunity as opposed to a crisis, lemmings leaping over the edge of the cliff and all the rest of it. But the difficulty I have is seeing in a democratic system like we have here in the United States and in Western Europe, how on earth can you really persuade enough people to start thinking of an us society instead of a me society? Thank you.
Lots to unpack there. The first thing I would say is I don't disagree with a single word you've said. I would expand upon what you've said, say it's not just our political class, who think in cycles of 2 years, 4 years. It's also our economic class who think in terms of quarterly reports. And the life expectancy, if I can put it that way, of a CEO, the average CEO stays in office for 6 years. So when you're talking to a CEO about what the world will look like in 2100, they're gone with their bonus within 6 years. So they don't have to think long term. So I do think that short-termism is a major, major problem in all of this. I do think the me issue, as opposed to the us issue, is something that can be addressed. And I've tried to address it by using what I call a vocabulary of arguments. And I've relayed this illustration before in my talks. Gloria mentioned that I started in the United States as a representative of the government of the Maldives. And it was my job to go to Capitol Hill and to try and persuade members of Congress to take this issue seriously. And I found that if I went and spoke about ecology and environment and polar bears and ice caps, there was a limited number of predominantly liberal Democrats who would open their door and listen to the argument and were ready-made to support the argument. But that's it. All the other doors were shut. But if I went back the next day with a different vocabulary to apply to a different set of incentives and motivations, whether it was human rights or faith, in the case of John McCain, it was national security. If I went back, having first and foremost taken the time to understand the audience and what incentivizes them and what motivates them, what their challenges are, what their needs are, what could be done to move them, then I found that things were able to change. And I think we have plenty of examples through history of leaders who were willing to do that. The famous phrase of the Johnson treatment, for example, in the 1960s, opening up possibilities for the Great Society, opening up possibilities for civil rights reform through a combination of reward and threat, frankly. So I do think that we can overcome some of this, not all of it, by segmentation. One of the great things I think that public relations and media people have learned over time was that every audience is segmented. So if you watch some game from the NFL on a Sunday, you're going to see Budweiser ads. And if you're watching the golf tournament right after it, you're going to see ads for the Mercedes C-Class, because they know that it's a different demographic and they're going to use different arguments, different champions, different motivations, different incentives. We within the environment community have not done that. We've been stuck in our own bubble, talking to ourselves, assuming that everybody agrees with us, assuming that everybody is excited by the same things that we're excited about, and frankly being lazy in our messaging. And I think we've done that for 2 decades, and it hasn't helped, and I think we're still doing it. The last thing I would say is, I do think a lot of this does come back to structure of democracy, but also to individual leadership within that democracy. So for example, the structure of our democracy is failing us. It's failing us because of gerrymandering. It's failing us because of campaign finance. There's now this expression that you hear every election cycle, the first primary. And when people elaborate on that, they're not talking about Iowa. They're talking about the donors and the campaign staffers that you have to win over during the summer, long before Iowa ever happens. Because if you don't have those donors on board, you're doomed from the get-go. So campaign finance. The fact that we have a two-party system, and that two-party system, because of incumbency rates, means that you're more likely to lose your seat from a primary rather than from a competitive general election. The fact that we have a 50-50 Senate, even though the Democrats in that Senate have 15 million more votes behind them, because the state of California with close to 50 million people has the same number of senators as Vermont with 600,000. The fact that the District of Columbia or Puerto Rico cannot send people to the United States Senate. If they were, we would not be dependent on Joe Manchin's vote from West Virginia for Build Back Better. So there's all sorts of structural problems, and we're not even getting into disenfranchisement through voter restriction. All sorts of structural problems that need to be addressed. But I also think there's a personal accountability problem in our leaders. I'm a big soccer fan. I'm obliged to call it soccer because I'm here. I normally call it football. I'm a big soccer fan, and my favorite soccer coach, he once said, I want players who are willing to lose in order to win. I don't see leaders who are willing to risk and willing to lose in order to win. I see people who are fixated with re-election. I've encountered politicians who will tell me between November and January, so between their election and taking an oath of office, they will already begin to tell me that they're thinking about the next primary cycle 18 months down the line, and that is influencing their thinking even before they've taken the oath of office. So I think we need to have leaders, and we do have some of them, there are illustrations, who are willing to stand up and say, this is what I believe in, this is what I'm going to do, back me or sack me. That's personal accountability. We need CEOs who are willing to do the same. There are political leaders, there are CEOs, they're a very small minority, but I think when it comes to the issue of education, that's what we should be educating people on. We shouldn't be educating people about wind turbines. We should be educating people that the world we live in now requires people of creativity and courage. That's what you need to have. They're the tools you need to have for this century.
We have a question from the Zoom audience. The Vermont Climate Council is presenting its climate action plan to the legislature on December 1st and will include public comment on ongoing discussions this year and future years. Given that the Vermont legislature overturned Governor Scott's veto on the Global Warming Solutions Act, and there exists a record number of legislators on the Climate Solutions Caucus, including our own Bennington Rep. Kathleen James, do you feel at all hopeful that our legislators can make an impact this time on the Vermont Climate Action Plan and have the courage to stand up to the existing power structure within the Public Utilities Commission and the agencies appointed by Governor Scott?
So, the first thing I should say is that I applaud the intent of the members of the Climate Caucus and more broadly the representatives within the House and the Senate who have taken this issue seriously and who did respond to Governor Scott's rejection of his own Climate Commission, because let's not forget he set up the Climate Commission, then refused to meet with them, then refused to implement any of their recommendations. And so the House and Senate, in passing the Global Warming Solutions Act, put in place a mechanism that it would make it would ease the passage of any further future recommendations, and they're to be applauded for that. However, there's a couple of problems, I think, with what they've done. The first is they have basically set up the same sort of process that we had the first time around, which leads me to expect that the recommendations and conclusions will be a copy-paste of what we had last time around. And what we had last time around did not have the creativity, did not have the courage, did not look at the right things in total. Second thing that they've done is they've unfortunately passed a degree of the accountability for what they themselves should be responsible for to the Vermont Climate Council. I would have been much happier to see the legislature itself take the recommendations of the Vermont Climate Commission, vote on each of them and pass them, and then have to be accountable before their own electorate, go out and speak about the opportunities, and speak about the costs, and speak about the heavy lift, and take responsibility for that. And they didn't do that. So I do think it's going to be, to a certain extent, a copy-paste. I don't think it's going to have the creativity. Is it going to overcome some of the most important challenges? I think the questioner has answered his or her own question. The big issue is the fact that there is a Public Utility Commission that has a disproportionate amount of influence without having sufficient accountability, and I think that is likely to go on. I would like personally to see Governor Scott, however, not only embrace the recommendations coming out of commissions or councils, I would like to see Governor Scott as a Republican voice within a larger movement that is skeptical of the science, that is leading the climate denial in this country, be the same sort of voice that Governor Hogan of Maryland has become, which is a national figure from the Republican movement willing to call bullshit on his Republican colleagues and willing to lead this issue nationally. And I don't think the governor has done that. I don't think he is going to do that. And for that reason and that reason alone, I would say that also there needs to be a strong challenger to the government, to the governor in the next election cycle. I think the Democratic Party in recent election cycles have put up weak candidates against Governor Scott because they've known they're likely to lose. I think it's now time for them to put up a strong candidate against Governor Scott.
Doesn't a lot of this have to do with consumers? That if, I don't know anyone who owns an electric car, but everyone would love to have one if they were less expensive. Mm-hmm. That Derek mentioned heat pumps. Mm-hmm. If it was affordable, more affordable, people would gravitate. I think the market would solve that, especially if you educated people, on the climate problem. Even the economic class, they're really responding to consumers and what they want. I never thought the day would come when shopping malls would close down because people found something that they found was more effective and at a better price. I think that people would gravitate towards those things which are more environmentally friendly. Perhaps you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so let's talk about the issue of cost. The first thing to bear in mind is that the bad things are kept cheap because of perverse subsidies. And I outlined that on one of the slides, the amount of subsidies that go to fossil fuels, the amount of subsidies that go, for example, to an extractive form of agriculture. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Another thing to bear in mind is, and the book that I have covers this, I don't believe for a second that you should talk about spending unless you're also talking about revenue generation, because legitimately people are afraid of things like deficits and debts. And there are ways through carbon pricing, there are ways through, for example, going after corporations with corporate tax, as opposed to, for example, going after workers with income tax. There's ways, for example, through the repatriation of profits that are currently sheltered in tax havens. There's ways through, for example, addressing inheritance tax. There's all manner of ways in which we can raise revenue that can then be redirected towards subsidizing good consumption patterns rather than bad consumption patterns. I absolutely believe that too much of what we have on climate and environment right now is an environmentalism of the elite. It is people standing before an audience saying, of course you can solarize your house, and why don't you have a Tesla? Which is absolute nonsense. We know that that's absolute nonsense, which is why a movement has grown in recent years called an environmentalism of the working class. We have more than enough money to be able to redirect support so that, for example, a carbon price does not have to have a disproportionate impact on low-income populations, because you can put in the right sorts of social safeguards and social safety nets to move the burden, the financial burden, from those low-income populations to others. We have more than enough money to actually subsidize the types of changes in people's homes and in people's mobility and their energy use and their food consumption that would enable lower income populations to be able to afford that type of consumption. But we choose not to invest money in that way. And that's a political choice. And again, that's why for me, it doesn't all come back to innovation and technology. For me, it all comes back to politics. Because I've enough experience all around the world to see that when politicians lead and when the political enabling environment is properly constructed, this type of transformation is possible. And it's possible to make this transformation in a way that benefits the marginalized, as opposed to imposing yet another crisis and yet another burden on them. But in this particular system, we've chosen not to do that. In this particular system, which is an economic system with its tentacles deep into our political system, we have chosen to protect the wealth class as opposed to choosing to protect the income class. And that is something we have to change. And that's why, in response to Derek's earlier question, people like Bill McKibben and people like Jim Hansen, the climatologist, they've said we cannot fix the climate until we first fix our democracy. But ultimately, I think a new generation of leaders can be equipped, can be educated, and can help us, I think, to lead this transition. I continue to be cautiously hopeful.